record and to welcome a very special guest with us today, Kate Green, who is going to be with us for the first part of the session, and then she has to leave to get on a plane. Kate is coming to us from the JFNA, and through her devotion, commitment to this whole area of mental wellness, she, on behalf of her department, has made sure that the finance was available to run these sessions. So, Kate, thanks so much. We filled Kate in about the previous sessions. I'm thrilled that you're joining us today for our session today.
Very happy to be here. Thank you all for having me. And I'll just be listening in and observing and maybe chiming in on the chat as it makes sense. But I'm just happy to be here and supporting this project. Thank you. Awesome. Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be with you for what is sadly our fourth and final session together. So as we are, embarking on this final round of our journey, and our time is going to be spent today really thinking about how do we create a healthy, safe environment? What does it mean to really, we've gone down a long road at this point, and we've talked about, what are the mental health concerns that are impacting youth today. We've looked at, unfortunately, the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey came out after, but happy to share a little more information on that later with everyone. But, we've looked at what does this look like for the JCCs around policies and procedures that you should have? What does this look like in terms of, the professionals and the issues and challenges that you're seeing in our last group, when we were able to bring together just the professionals to really, or just the youth serving professionals to really think about what this looks like and the impacts that you can have on your own work and with the youth or the teens that you serve directly. And today we're really going to be focusing in on, okay, so what does this look like to create a healthy, safe JCC? And so when we think about healthy environments, I want to invite you all to either click here and go to menti.com or pick up your phone. And on menti.com, you will have the opportunity to put in the code that you see up top, or you should be able to see up top. Can you all see the code? Awesome. All right, so put in that code and answer this question. What does a healthy, safe JCC look like to you? Feel free to answer it a couple of times, but what does this look like? What are we aiming for here? What does a healthy, safe JCC look like? Inclusive, emotional safety, welcoming. I like just the colors so far. What else? Vibrant. Oh, intentionally inclusive. That's interesting. Okay, we've got more coming up now. And for those who haven't done a Menti before, the bigger it is, it means the more times that it has been labeled or named. So inclusive and welcoming seem to be sticking out at the moment. Warm, open, inviting, all feelings welcome. I like it. Any others? Look out for each other. Any others that you would add? Yeah, so welcoming is really the big one that seems to be sticking out. Inclusive immediately after it. Approachable, safe. Yeah, so when we think about, right, this idea of healthy, this idea of inclusive and welcoming and warm and safe, right? When we think of all of that, what does that mean in terms of, how the environment itself has to be set up, right? What does that mean in terms of what we need to be looking at? Maybe, well, didn't mean to do that. So what's stopping or blocking you from creating that environment? Again, go in, you can enter. What do you think is sort of stopping or blocking your JCC, or you, right? You here being the JCC, from creating that space? A lack of participation. Is that participation of professionals, of members, of physical space, time, money? Yeah. Can't prioritize it. And it here, are we talking about that safety? Are we talking about the mental, emotional, social health? Like what? I know I'm asking more questions on top of the question, so I'll let the question just sort of percolate. Too many decision makers. That's interesting. Training and leadership. Yeah, I think those are two big ones, right? So as we've talked about leading up to now, this idea of training and leadership being really essential pieces of the puzzle, that if we expect people to be able to do something, they need the training, the role modeling, the training, the support, right, to be able to do it. And so if we can't prioritize it, if we can't put, right, the time, the money, all of those different pieces so that the staff have the resources, the tools that they need to implement, then yeah, how can we expect it to sort of live up to that space? For sure. So I think this is really interesting. So one of the reasons, right, we start here is it's important to think about, to look at, and to understand, right, what does that healthy, safe environment look like? And when we think about, creating safe environments, ultimately, I start to bring it down to two things. That, the keys to really creating that safe space or that safe environment. Sorry, I'm juggling between the two screens. Right? There's two key elements when it comes to these safe environments, or to creating and maintaining safe environments, and it falls on a spectrum. One is recognition and the other is frequency. And when we look at the spectrum, right, it kind of looks like this. And so when we think about the environment that we want to create, right, the environment we want to create for ourselves, for the youth that participate, for all of these things, right? We talk about these two things of recognition and frequency. Recognition is how likely am I to see a behavior and say, that's not good. That's creating an unhealthy space, an unsafe environment, right? And frequency is how often that thing is going to occur. And so we pair them up on this spectrum of high recognition behaviors, right, and low frequency. So if something is really bad, it sets off our alarm bells, right? If you saw a kid hit another kid in front of you, or if you heard a staff member walk up to a kid and start yelling at them, how many of you, show of hands, whatever, would be able to say, that's bad. That's creating an unhealthy, unsafe space? Yes, I think most of you would do that, right? I would hope, right? You see one physically attack someone, Ian, thank you. You're helping me. I appreciate it. So we pair that up. What is harder and what creates this, sort of undercurrent of unsafe space, right, is the low recognition, high frequency behaviors. These are things that we may not automatically have a gut reaction to, or they're the things that are happening around us and we're like, oh, that's not good, but like, is it really that bad? Right? Like it's the kind of feeling, but it happens so frequently that it really creates that that it starts to undermine, I should say, it doesn't create, but it starts to undermine, right, the larger goals of the environment in the safe space. So I want to open it up to you all, either unmute and share without me giving you examples, right? What do you think falls on this low recognition, high frequency end of the spectrum? Again, it's the, but it's okay. Or, oh, it only happens now and again, or kinds of things. What do you think falls on that end of the spectrum that could create an unsafe space? Ian, go for it. Yeah.
Coaches yelling at kids.
Say that again.
Coaches yelling at kids in sports. Harder! You're not trying hard enough. You stupid, we went over this in practice. It's kind of accepted, but depending on the age of the kids, it's not good.
Yeah, and some of them don't always yell back like some of us used to at our coaches, right?
Well, they might yell back and then they'll be told, who's going to run tomorrow?
Fair.
I mean, I had a situation earlier this year where a kid messed up the time of practice and showed up half an hour late and walked in with his bag of chips. And the coach said, what are you doing? Well, I messed up the time, coach. Why you open up a bag of chips? Get running. Oh, but coach, it's just chips. Oh, it's just chips. Took the bag away and gave every kid else chips and said, now you run the rest of the practice. I was kind of mortified the next day when I heard about this. I'm like, I get it, but the kid's 14.
Right.
Kid's 14.
Right. And so we're trying to teach something, right? Like being accountable, showing up on time, right? Like there are things and skills we are trying to teach, and what is the way in which we are doing that maybe doesn't create the environment we're trying to create, right? So shaming, right? Like I want to name it a little bit, shaming a kid, shaming them for showing up late, right? Forcing that. So that kind of verbal interaction between whether it's a coach, whether it's right, a staff member in the J, what else? What are some other things that sort of pop up on this other side of the spectrum?
Going along the same lines as like those verbal prompts or cues, like I think that kids say concerning things verbally to adults they trust. And like I know we have a lot of high school staff who just like take it and roll with it. Or like they say to the swim coach who only sees them for 15 minutes a week and they don't think anything of it. But then when we're all just chit-chatting in the hallway and we start to put together that full picture, it's like, oh, this is high frequency and this moves very quickly from low recognition to like a high priority item.
Yeah.
I'm thinking mostly along the lines of like when children share things about like their own personal safety at home, or comments about eating that can get that teeter on that border of, are we just talking about food, or is there a clinical problem there that needs to be explored?
Yeah, so when we think about the overall environment we're creating, right, missing the cues of what kids are saying, also not hearing, not truly listening, not truly hearing, or not being prepared to deal with, right, some of the things that our kids are saying that lead us to believe something else might be going on, right?
And a little bit of like, not sure who's taking responsibility for this. Like the swim instructor who sees them for a half hour and hears something really concerning, is it their responsibility to then own that and follow through with that? Do they push it to the family life engagement people? Like a little bit of like question about leadership, like, oh, it's not my problem, not my kid, I won't deal with it.
Right, not my monkeys, not my circus, right? We talked a little bit about this on our last session with just the youth professionals, but this idea of like the front desk watching a kid who's just losing it in front of them, or right, the kid at swim or the kid over here, like who is responsible, and how easy is it in a J environment to be like, not my monkeys, not my circus, and sort of take that step back when like the reality is every single person is our responsibility. Yeah. Tyson, did you have something you were going to add to that low recognition, high frequency end of the spectrum?
No, I'm sorry. I just hopped in late. I think I had my mic on. Sorry about that.
No worries. I did not mean to put you in the hot seat. My apologies.
That's good. No, thanks. Thanks for asking.
Anybody else?
Way to embarrass him and shame him, verbally abusive. I think we just
See?
went over this recently.
My bad. So yes, I think, right, some of the other pieces I would add over on this like low recognition, high frequency end of the spectrum, right, is objectification. I would add the music we're playing. I would add, right, the conversations that we overhear and don't step in on. I would add, how are we seeing, responding to, right? And how is that being shut down or lifted up in a way that sort of glorifies poor behavior? Because part of what we're talking about here isn't just, right, like how we're looking at individuals, but how are we looking at the J overall, and how is the J itself responding to behaviors? And so, if you have, just kids able to run into a classroom that's unlocked and they're using it to do whatever, or, spaces where you hear, whether it's a staff member, whether a member, right, somebody else walking by a group of kids, are like, damn, she grew up, right? Or using language as objectifying or sort of, yeah, I love that, unintentional negligence, just not noticing it, low recognition, high frequency for sure, right? We just don't see it. We don't see the behavior, or the kids are allowed to sort of use inappropriate language, right? All of that, those behaviors add up over time. Right? It really does add up. And so what does it do is it chips away at what you're trying to create. And so if you as a JCC overall are trying to create this safe space where people can come, they can be themselves, right? I go back to that word cloud we created before, right? You're trying to create the safe, warm, welcoming kind of environment. But the reality is lots of these behaviors actually take away from that. Right? What do they create? When there's lots of these low recognition, I'm pointing at a screen that you can't see me point at, so I don't know why I'm doing that. Lots of these high recognition, right? High frequency, low recognition behaviors, right? It really sets up an unsafe space where there's a common disrespect of boundaries, where, people can't expect that their boundaries are going to be respected, or that communication is going to happen in a way that is safe and supportive. There's a normalization of inappropriate, it doesn't just have to be sexual, right? Like generally inappropriate behavior and boundary crossing behavior, which then people don't feel safe stepping up or speaking up. Right? Part of what this sets up is when you have a lot of those low frequency behaviors, nobody feels safe challenging the status quo. Nobody feels safe sort of stepping up and saying, yeah, no, that's not okay. Or stop it. Or, hey, cut that out. Or to the coach who's screaming, like, what is the purpose? Right? Nobody feels comfortable, safe stepping up and doing that. And so we create this environment where, because nobody feels comfortable, right? The bystanders, there are no upstanders, there are only bystanders. And ultimately we create a space that has some really unhealthy and unsafe patterns of behavior for everyone. And whether that's in, right, our camp programs, our athletic programs, our swim programs, whether that is just in general walking through the J, right? People don't feel comfortable stepping in and being supported in that space because of those, because of the way it is set up. Thoughts or questions on this?
I suppose I have a question, Drew, as somebody from the outside. You talk about apathetic bystanders, and I agree, absolutely. But then you could have, we don't want to invite a situation where every member feels that they can make a comment about a behavior and like step into the professional arena of the team professional or do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
The sort of the do-gooders.
Yeah. But everyone has an opinion. So, I think that you you want an environment where everyone feels comfortable at the least speaking up and speaking out against something that they don't necessarily agree with or they think isn't going in the right way, right? And how do you do that in a way that is productive and not doesn't take away from the environment? Everyone has an opinion, right? And that's great. And how do you provide that feedback in a very real way that allows for some of this dialogue, communication, right? Opening that space in that way. Does that make sense? And again, I think it's not necessarily about everyone having an opinion or taking the role of the youth professional, but it is about being able to speak up and speak out when something doesn't seem okay. Other thoughts or questions? So if this is right, the bad, then what's the good? What is the environment that we want to be creating? And I'm going to stop sharing and look at you all for a minute. What is the environment then that we want to be creating? What's our role? Yeah, Naomi, go for it.
Hi everyone. I think that it's really like a big picture culture shift, and like people within organizations, within my JCC, JC Manhattan, like are at very different places in their understanding of like where we're going. Or there hasn't been necessarily clear communication about that, which is part of my new role.
Yeah. So different people having different opinions about where you're going, and someone, right? Like someone have to sort of owning that process moving forward. Yeah. What else? What else is our role here? Or at least how does the JCC set that up?
Drew,
Mhm.
maybe being a voice of invitation, of opportunity. Perhaps instead of saying we must do this, we should do this, which doesn't always lead to productive, outcomes, to say, how might we, or let's invite us to think about considering this policy or considering this practice that not only helps with teen mental health, but also just helps engage families, which gets more people into the JCC. So is there like an invitation perspective or frame to do this based on what we've known and learned through these sets of trainings that could lead to some positive movement?
Yeah, right. Because the more that we are in those spaces, the more that we are like really opening up, right, who the JCC is, the reality is the more you're inviting in, Mark, I think you're totally right. The more you're inviting in families and groups, and they are feeling comfortable and safe in this place, right? So it's advantageous for everyone to really be able to be in that, in this same place, right? Of creating the safe environment and living up to that safe environment. And when we think about, right, like what does it mean to truly be safe? These are massive organizations in a lot of cases, right? There isn't just the youth side of things. There's a whole larger picture of that we're operating in and that we are operating around. And so how do we think about that, right, in terms of what we're offering or what we're able to then build out in terms of training and policy, right? And all the different pieces that help to make the larger JCC that safe, welcoming environment. So I want you all to take a minute and think about your own JCC, right? Take 60 seconds. I'll set a timer, right? Take 60 seconds and think about if you were to really go back and bring this back, what would you need to start to think about, as Mark said, and start to have that conversation around how we improve the overall environment at our JCC. What are the pieces that you need? So 60 seconds to sort of think about that. See, I'm setting a timer. Go.
I have a thought on that.
Yeah.
It's, in the gym, we have rules, and then, part of the job is making sure that folks are following the rules so that it's, safe and comfortable. But with the kids, sometimes they'll be sort of repeat offenders, quote unquote. And I start to think though, just saying stop is not really is not doing much if it's maybe attention, or or maybe, I don't know, like right now there's a situation where there's a couple of kids who sort of act out a bit when they're in there, and I try to understand their situation, but I don't want to probe too much. One is maybe definitely working out too much, and his grandfather was in there the other day, and I was having a conversation with him, and he said, well, I think it's too much. And I said, yeah, I think it is maybe a little excessive too. And I said, have you talked with him about it? And he said, well, not really, but maybe you guys could talk with him about it. So, I'm trying to kind of connect with them, but it's, difficult if there's this maybe a disconnected home. It's sort of so it's like there's really no, outside of enforcing the rules, there isn't much in the way of sort of a framework for handling situations like that. But I just try to make sure that folks are safe, and then, if there's opportunity to connect, kind of take advantage of that.
Yeah, so taking advantage of the opportunities to connect. What else, how else could you start to advocate for this change within your JCC? What would you need to be able to do that?
I think just bringing it to, the leadership, the directors, and saying, just asking for their advice, or saying, should we have some kind of guidelines for this? Because we want them there, we want them exercising, and it's great that they're taking that initiative. But we also want them to be safe and sort of doing things appropriately at the same time. But I think just bringing it to them and just seeing what they say, and I've done that in the past, and this is just sort of a unique situation that it's usually very helpful. It's usually always, whatever we come up with is usually really good. So
Yeah. What else? I mean, when you think of the roadblocks, right? We had said, what's stopping or blocking you? Time, money, space, lack of importance, too many decision makers, right? Like, what changes that at your JCC, or what is that changing force?
I guess just me bringing it up, really, it seems like, because I don't think there really are too many barriers financially and things like that. Or time wise. Folks are usually pretty good about responding and taking the time to have conversations when these things come up. So it just sort of seems like an evolving, every situation is unique. So at the same time, maybe I'm not sure if having some kind of like a written framework would be the best approach. Yeah.
Definitely. So here's what we're going to do next. And I apologize, Sarah, because I did not warn you about this, but I'm making a change as we're on the fly, which is half the fun. We are going to, before we move further with like how I would recommend you fix this, or how, right, like how you could take this back, I would love to go into smaller groups and let you talk about like what are some of the roadblocks in your JCC to, right, creating this healthy, safe space, and what are some of the solutions. And so we'll go into 3 breakout rooms, and the question you're trying to solve is, how do you overcome How would you overcome those roadblocks to a healthier JCC? And what I mean by that is that healthy, safe environment that we're looking to create, right? Think about the things that are stopping you and how you might be able to really overcome some of that. All right, we'll send you all away. You have about 5 minutes and we'll be back soon. See you soon. Tried to hit the button at the same time. So who wants to share out how would they fix this, or what came up in your groups that you think you just want to lift up for other people or could be useful for others to hear?
I just had a quick thought. Maybe I think for us, maybe a barrier would be having a framework for how to work with parents if that's needed. Because that seems to be kind of out there. Like, do we send an email? Do we try to call? What kind of conversation do we have? That kind of thing. And I had a conversation with, the boy's grandfather, and honestly, I didn't know what to say. I mean, I understood his point of view. Of course, it wasn't a planned conversation either. But he was sort of putting the ball in our court, and I wasn't really sure where to go with it.
Yeah, so having some sort of guide for conversations with families or having some sort of touch point. Amy, I think, I heard in your group as you all were sort of working through something similar, that having, right, like some kind of reminder or having something that could then utilize or leverage that connection point back to the larger JCC. I don't know if you all.
Well, I kind of observed two things, and one of them was people are able to name the problem, and like empowering oneself to like be the change and say like, actually, you got to raise your hand and like almost hold your management accountable and say, I need this from you guys. I need this policy written. I need you to train everyone on it. I need to be empowered to remind my peers. And if one is like, depending on where you sit in the organization, it can be hard to hold your peers accountable, but like empowering. And if publicly I say, Aliza is allowed to tell any of you to stop swearing in the hallways because that's not okay for our children. Like if one of us of any level of management is swearing in the hallways because we're talking to an adult, like Aliza can look at us and she has been publicly like appointed and empowered to do so. But if the management is less aware that like things are breaking down, it's really hard to like support everyone and then give everyone the foundation. The other example I used was fear is a really good tool. So if you can bring examples of things not going so well in other organizations, and the two examples I used, and I won't go into great detail, but the ones I shared, and maybe my team who is mostly like off now, I'm not seeing faces, thought it was ridiculous. But after the USA gymnasts held Larry Nassar accountable, I took an article from People magazine, super basic, like the brass tacks into my leadership team. It's like 15 people, I guess it was our bigger leadership team. And I said, we're going to read this article and we're going to read how many people thought and knew something was going on and kind of just uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. And now you have what, 75 gymnasts standing up in a trial. None of us want to be associated with a situation like that, where we are one of those people who are like, well, I don't know, kind of seemed off. Like, you don't want to be that. Here's an example, use it. And then on a positive side of like the Texas synagogue, when the rabbi did such a great job with the shooter of getting everyone out the door and like just literally putting to use every bit of our training, I walked the team through and I said, guys, we're going to talk about what this rabbi did. And explicitly, like at what point did they think about how the phone was placed and how they moved around the room, and just like, so examples of other things and who you like, examples of great and examples of this is not what we don't want to be in the news for this. Like those can be, I think, really motivating tools in basic language. So
yeah, and I think so much of, Amy, what you just said, right, it falls down here, right? All of the pieces, if you look at Larry Nassar, if you look at some of these larger cases, right, it's a lot of these maybe even starts to move this way in terms of the behavior, but at the end of the day, it's sort of like, I don't know, it's not so bad. I guess it's okay, right? And what happens over time is that nobody steps up, nobody feels comfortable saying something. And so I love that idea of using what's happening, right, in the environment. And if you need a, right, like a starting point, I guess, for what to do there. I was not planning on sharing this slide, so y'all are going to have to give me a minute to pull it up. This is the second time this has happened to me today, so I should learn from my own mistakes. Is that it? Is that what I'm looking for? Yep. So, you know, I think especially as we're talking about, right, like mental health and what is happening, you don't have to look far for examples in the news right now to be able to bring that back, right? And this took me, creating this little slide did not take me very long, right? But if you look at it, what do you see? Right? You see that there's a crisis, you see there's an issue, you see something's happening, right? Death, destruction, fire. No, I'm kidding. But like, what does this do? It starts to highlight the issue. And so Amy, I love that as a way of sort of like leveraging the issue, bringing in the article, bringing in the piece to sort of say like, no, this is really happening and we need to pay attention to it. I think that's super important. And how do you maybe give voice power, right, to a group of people who may not always have that voice or that power? And I think, you know, sometimes we look at youth professionals and we're like, oh, it's just they work with the kids. Like that's the people who work with the kids. Well, no, those are the people who are really the backbone of the JCC and what they're trying to do and accomplish in terms of engaging the community. And so how do we reframe how we look at that work to truly leverage the professionals that are doing it and to help give that voice back? Yeah, Naomi, what were you? I saw your hand.
In our group, a few people shared something that resonated with me, which was that there's a lot of like disjointedness among departments and people doing different things in the organization. So I think like Amy talked to like a bit of like a kind of coming from the top model because that's your position. I think there's also a power in gathering up your people across like other levels, not senior levels of the organization. And that's something I'm trying to do right now is like, okay, this person is like really like attuned to these issues in aquatics, in sports, in camp. So let's find the like power in then raising up these issues within the different departments by collaborating together. So this is something recently a specific concern was raised within aquatics about the way that some of the instructors were speaking about people's bodies. So that's, what is that? A low?
Yeah, low recognition, high frequency.
Thank you. I think that's an example of a place where I'm going to try to work within aquatics to develop like a framework for how we think about this and maybe bring in training and then include other people because they're coming to us in the senior level. They're coming to us and saying, we know this is an issue and we're not sure what to do about it. So that's just another way of thinking about working within these often large frameworks.
Yeah, I love that. And shifting the system, right? Culture change is something that is slow moving. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work. And so part of what we're trying to do is getting a whole system to see the world the way we see it, which is very different. And if you all remember this slide from our very, very first time together, right? What are we trying to do? We're trying to move an institution in this direction, right? We're trying to move from being reactive to proactive, from living in the gray to setting some boundaries, from saying no to saying yes. One thing I heard, I will say Dr. Deborah Gilboa say recently, right, is like you saying no is also what you're saying yes to. And so how do you think about reframing, right, of what we as an organization or an institution are saying no to is what we're saying yes to. And if what we're saying yes to is being a communal gathering place, then how are we setting that up in a way that is welcoming, inclusive, and safe for all, right? How do we set that up in a way that is building that environment up and not tearing it down through those, right, sort of very low recognition, but high frequency behaviors that overall, right, undermine everything that we're trying to do. So I think that's right. That's a really important piece of the puzzle that we had talked about from the very beginning of this group, is how do we move ourselves from this one side of the arrow to the other side? And that's not just you, and it's not just the responsibility of, right, like the person on this call, but it's the responsibility of the entire institution to be thinking about moving from this side to that side, right? That's the bigger picture. Anything else that came up in your groups that you want to share out? So how do you all, right, as whether you work directly with youth or with others, start to role model this, right? How do you start to think about working with youth safely and working in the larger JCC environment safely? Right, there's sort of three keys when it comes to working with youth safely that I think are really important, and I want to make sure that we talk about, right? Which is that, is your interaction appropriate, observable, and interruptible, right? That's the golden rule. That's the big three of working with youth safely. Is it appropriate? Is it observable? Is it interruptible? If you've ever been in a training of mine, you have probably heard me say this a million times. But when it comes to setting boundaries, maintaining boundaries, role modeling boundaries for youth, right? So much of our work is about, is it appropriate, observable, interruptible, right? And when it comes to shutting down inappropriate behaviors or thinking about, right, boundaries in particular and setting up these healthy, safe environments, so much of that changes in dynamic to who we're working with, where we are, what's happening, right? You're a role model. It's really tough to constantly be under that light. And right, how do we think about how this plays out for us, for staff, for others, and start to bring this framework into the larger JCC, right? Because if we're constantly thinking about, okay, is it appropriate? Is it observable? Is it interruptible? Is it part of my normal job description? Can anybody see what I'm doing? Can anybody interrupt and know the purpose, know the reason, right? That's how we work with youth safely. And when we think about working in the larger JCC context in a safe environment, right, and creating an environment that is healthy, that is welcoming, that is inclusive, these principles still apply, right? They still come in, they still are able to sort of set us up for success or failure, depending on how we are able to live by that. You know, I think this comes up in many different ways. If we think about, right, both the spectrum we're trying to create and where we're trying to hit, and then how this comes up. But I do think that it is, right, such a key principle of how we are setting ourselves as professionals up for success. And those who work with us as well, right? How do we teach this? How do we train on this? How do we bring this back to the larger group, larger institution, and sort of think about it in that larger way? And when we think about, right, how we're setting up in general for success, right? How we're setting up for that success that we talked about and really moving the needle within the larger institution, right? We talked about this whole idea of really bringing this back, but then thinking about like these key considerations that we had talked about before. What is your structure, right? We have to go back to where we started, which is that we need to think about the system itself and how the system is set up, right, to support some of these things. So the healthy environment has a direct relationship to the system that is supporting it. Right? We can't ignore that. Those two things are in tandem. They do work with and push against one another, right? And so this isn't the first time you all are seeing this slide. This slide is a repeat again, right, of something that came up much earlier. But when we think about, right, how are we dealing with issues? What is our culture? Who are we? And who do we want to be? The mission, the values. How are we prepared for roadblocks? Right? The reason I have you name what's in the way is not to be like, this is insurmountable, we'll never get over it. But it's to think logically about, okay, then what can I advocate for change for? What does need to change in order to be, right, this space that is welcoming, that is able to deal with it? Who are your community partners? You are not equipped to handle every challenge, and you shouldn't be the clearinghouse for every issue and every challenge. So how do you think about, right, who is the community support, the available space where you can get that help, that support, that, that feedback even. You don't have to do this alone. And I think adding to what, Amy, you had said before about, being the one to advocate for change, maybe it's a community partner actually that has to be the one to come in and sort of show the roadmap or show the way or say like, hey, I noticed this. If we go back to the I statements that we talked about, right? I noticed, I saw, I feel. It actually doesn't just work for responding to kids, but it can mirror back, right? Here's what we're seeing. And it could mirror back for others, like how that is being perceived or where that gap is, right? And could a community partner be the one to shine that light or hold up the mirror or be able to sort of be better equipped to help make that change? I don't know, but right, it at least opens the door or puts a foot in the door. Does this help at all to think about, right, like where you could go to make that change when it comes to, creating those healthy, safe environments?
It definitely helps. I'm wondering, some of the things we talked about, like especially with the Nasser situation is, if you think something's a big deal and you state your case, but you're maybe the only one. Other folks say, yeah, then maybe they have some concern, but they don't think it's as big a deal as you do, and then the situation might become rather tense, and then you sort of find yourself at odds with the folks that you're trying to get help from. So that I think that could be a sticking point sometimes. I mean, not for me per se, but I can see that being an issue. Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're wrong, right? You can't always be the squeaky wheel. And I think sometimes we, right, as youth professionals feel very strongly about like, we should prioritize this. And the focus is it's not here because that's not technically where the dollars are coming from. So if the focus isn't here, but it's over here, how do we make the case that this does impact that? And I'm not saying it's all driven by dollars, but like, how do we build that case? And, or how do you accept that sometimes the things we can't change are going to be the things we can't change? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, hearing these bigger stories certainly helps put things in context. Like, I mean, sometimes it's like I do have to compare to other situations that are far worse. Yet at the same time, the little things, the little nagging things can, be a real drain, from one day to the next. Even if, maybe there's, a law isn't being broken or it doesn't necessarily, would be classified as an abusive situation, it could still be an opportunity to, improve, how the community kind of connects. But I think if there's resistance there, or yeah, uh, so I think it's like stating the case properly and, bringing folks in and maybe looking at folks as sort of partners, not opposition, that kind of thing. But I mean, I think sometimes the little things can fall on whoever's working the floor, and require, maybe a lot of creativity if they want to, if we want to kind of push further.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
why, right? Like those little things are why we need some overarching policies, or we need some other ways to, right, to come at this from different angles, because, right, what we're
Okay.
seeing or what we believe, right, needs a different angle or needs a different way in. And we don't want to ever say, right, like I think one of the things we do want to improve about the environment overall is how does everyone communicate as one machine, right? So like this all works together to serve a single purpose or to serve a single goal. And so how do we think about how each of these pieces maybe interact to feed that, to play into that, or play out of that?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are resources, right, that we've created and provided to help and support. I'm curious if you all have spent any time digging into those, or, have you found them helpful in some way so far, or been able to bring them in to start to sort of have some of these conversations or help change some of what's happening?
I shared the mesh cards for something to look at. I mean, the incident reports we already have, but I mean, it gives us a different version to look at. Maybe we'll make a few changes. For us here in Canada, we have different crisis support hotlines, but I mean, it's different tools for us to like, okay, this is what somebody else is bringing in. Let's look at what we have and where can we change, oh, this is a little idea we can tweak a little bit. So it gives us different versions. I mean, the mesh ones is probably the one I looked at the most.
Other thoughts, either on the resources or on the healthy environments, or
I mean, I think it's all great. It's all really been super helpful for me. Just knowing it's all there, especially for things that, without a doubt are issues. Certainly. So it's definitely been just like, good to have that there for me. Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I invite you all to share, whether here or when we get to the end on the evaluation, please, feel free to share more. I just think, that is a space, or at least a place where some of this, of what we're talking about in terms of that shifting the lens to create that safe environment, right, really can live and exist. And when we think about, the role that the youth professional plays in creating and maintaining that safe environment, right, like that is your job, that is your role, and you do have the ability to be able to really build that and create that safe space. to really help build out the environment itself. When I think about, right, like what is your job and how do we create those safe spaces, right? Ultimately, some of what I think about, right, is this, and I think this, hold on, again, navigating between multiple screens. Right, this is some of what we want to be able to bring. I'm realizing, hold on. There's an issue. Right, this is when we talk about like, what do we really want to be able to empower, and what do we want to be thinking about as we're creating these spaces and these environments? That, overall it is our job to create it, but it's the JCC's job overall as well. And so as we think about, right, how are we sharing information? How are we empowering each other to be safer? How are we empowering our youth also to be safer, right? What does that look like from the youth's perspective, that they're gaining the skills, the tools, that, we can help them to have boundaries, to follow rules, but also how are we communicating? How are we asking for help? How are we promoting that, that information and that piece across the boundaries to be able to communicate better? And so that, right, like this in turn, these principles create that healthier, safer space because we are working as a community to empower safety across the boundary. Thoughts or questions on this? Does this feel kind of obvious? Maybe. Stop sharing my screen.
Can I ask a maybe bold question?
Please.
Does everybody feel like they're confident that they can communicate and ask for help? So I'm sensing a lot of people identifying and naming some of these issues, and I don't want people in my organization, Elise is the only one here who can call me out, but to feel like they're in, especially if there's a tricky situation like that, people shouldn't feel alone. It is like absolutely our collective agency's jobs and like priority. And so, but I'm sensing kind of like this feeling of people seeing stuff, but not necessarily feeling equipped, empowered, or have the bandwidth. Maybe it's that like you're all, everyone's really busy and whatever, but like, and I'm trying to, totally honor the fact that I think it was Naomi who said, like, from my perspective, it's different because of my role in the organization, but I just want people to, like, I want to hear from people and how do people feel more confident in going and asking for help, or feeling like if you're not being heard, like rattle someone's cage. I mean, there's nothing more important than like safety of the people in our community. So it's like, how do we, like, what can people be doing or calling even on this cohort or reaching out to Drew when you
just one or two
I-
people?
I think that's a really good suggestion. I know, so from
I'm
personal
hearing
experience,
Actualization side of like.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Mocha.
The setup was.
Can you
all
hear me
done as a
now?
part of the setup for
Yeah, but can anyone else hear someone else in the background?
It's the background noise. I think there's someone else in your office.
Oh.
Maybe.
Could I throw something at Ethan? Maybe I can talk louder. Can I talk louder?
There you go.
Okay, so like personal experience, so I worked in healthcare for 11 years and it's very challenging when you feel like you're at the bottom too of like the barrel or whatever, and you see things that are wrong and you want to address them or other people aren't addressing it, like you've brought it to someone's attention and they've kind of like, they're like, yeah, okay, whatever, but then you don't see it escalate. I don't want to say I've gotten in trouble in medical experiences, but sometimes it was really hard for me I couldn't sit by and watch certain things happen. So I was very proactive and probably made some people very angry. But my experience now, because I had an experience, it's been 6 months, I think, since I've been working as the teen manager at Shalom Austin and as the city director for BBYO, where a situation happened, and I felt like I hadn't been here that long, and it was really upsetting to me, actually, what these boys were doing to these girls. And I was like, okay, there's really, I'm down here, like, how do I like, I personally believe that these consequences should happen to them, but I'm just like, do you know what I mean? I'm just a little worker bee. And, it was hard. I like basically just first I didn't do anything, and then I escalated the situation, or I more anonymously though, and like dropped it in some ears, like dropped what was happening in some people's ears. So it wasn't like directly me coming to them, or like there was like a paper trail per se, if that makes any sense. But and then there was like, then stuff was done and there was consequences for these boys' actions, which I was really happy to hear. But I'm hoping next time though, I do feel more empowered to say something like to escalate it to their boss, if that makes sense. Because in the moment, as I was finding out the information, I was getting very heated and passionate and protective, right? Of like what was happening to these teenagers. And my emotions were taking over, and I realized like I couldn't, I didn't have the right words to use at the moment, if that makes sense. So I was like, I better just not say anything, because I may just like be very aggressive and angry. But I think finding people of like mind and like getting feedback really helps. So that's what's been very helpful being here.
Yeah,
So I think to that point, and I mean, Drew, I think maybe something that's helpful is like, what are the resources or tools, like Malka's saying, like, okay, drop it in other, pull together some like other people to kind of start raising the issue in a way that's safe and comfortable and appropriate. But Drew, I also like, are there, are you or others available to be those sounding boards? Because guess what? Someone else can call your organization and say, hey, I caught wind of something and I think you might want to know about it. And no one's out there to try to get anyone in trouble, but like, because I think I mean, if there's a leader out there who doesn't want to fix these problems, we got other issues, right? It's just a question of like, are they listening when they need to listen? And again, I'm giving Aliza full permission to rattle my cage if she doesn't think I'm responding on situations like this. But I think that we're, that's our priority.
Yeah, and I don't think you're wrong. And I think, right, whether it's utilizing some of the people in this room, whether it's utilizing the JCCA professional board, right? I think the board where some of these materials are kept, right, to sort of like crowdsource and utilize and point out, like, here's what another organization or another JCC is doing, right? Or leveraging those, thank you, Mark, I didn't know exactly the name. How do we think about creating communities of support and communities of professionals really across the board? And again, it's one of the reasons I said maybe the partner organization is the right person to step in. Maybe, right? Like, can you create a group of people within your J who care about an issue, who are, right, like coming from different sides of the issue, and that they become the consulting, the advisory board, the, right, like the voice that's speaking up on some of this. So how do we, right, like create those communities? And yes, I am always available and always happy to talk through, right, those pieces as well. And happy to always be a resource and a sounding board. One thing we know as it comes to empathic strain and burnout is that feeling for you of being able to advocate for change is essential to preventing burnout. So that if you don't feel that you have those outlets, if you don't feel that you're able to do that, if you don't feel aligned with an agency's mission or values, or that the agency themselves is living up to their mission or their values, then, right, like then that creates conflict, and that conflict makes it challenging for you to be able to do your job, perform your role, and ultimately can lead to burnout. So it's important, right? Like for you, as you feel that conflict, to name it. And I think that if we feel like we're existing in a space that is really creating unhealthy, unsafe environments, right? And I go back to, if we look at that side of the spectrum, right? If we look at that side of the frequency and recognition spectrum in particular, and we look at the low frequency, high recognition behaviors, and we think about it from a work-life balance perspective, right? And we think about capacity to care, capacity to hold, capacity to do our jobs, right? If we feel burnt out on that end of the spectrum, then we're definitely not responding to all the little things that are happening around us and creating an unsafe environment. So that psychological safety is key to feeling like you can advocate for change. It was a very long-winded response, but hopefully made sense.
Not at all.
I just want to elevate, based on the most recent part of the conversation, the work you all are doing and the boldness and the bravery and the courage and the care that you all are bringing to the work of creating a healthy place for teens and adolescents, and frankly, everyone, to feel that the JCC is a place where they can feel comfortable, feel that they can share what's going on, or to be noticed. And I think this series and this partnership with BBYO CAW and with JFNA is to elevate the skills that you have so you can be that much more comfortable and skill-based with that caring and confidence that you already have. So it's my long-winded thank you. But I think it's worth mentioning again, given what we're talking about right now.
Thank you. I second that. Happy to take any other questions. I also recognize we may be wrapping, and that is wonderful. But also always happy to take any other questions, not just about what we've talked about today, but really, you know, across the time that we have spent together over the last 4 sessions. I'm happy to, you know, to really answer any questions you might have. I also do want to drop today's Survey Monkey in the chat. You will notice it is the same Survey Monkey that we have had in the past. Oop, maybe if I can find my, oh, that's why I have a touch screen. So yeah, happy to answer any questions. This is the Survey Monkey for today. I want to thank you all for being a part of this. You know, it's been really fun getting to learn with you all and getting to go over all of these different pieces together. And yeah, as you know, as Mark said, as Amy alluded to, you know, happy to continue to be a resource and continue to work in partnership with you all.
Wait, before we go, a shout out to Drew for your partnership and leadership. A huge shout out to Sarah Sless for being the engine behind this entire Be Well initiative, and also to Kate Green, who was on before, who, you know, helps us as the broader community and, you know, financially supports this work too. So, and again, to all of you.
Thank you all and have a wonderful day. I'll hang around for a few in case anyone has questions that they don't want to ask, and enjoy your last 10 minutes back.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Mark. And thank everybody who participated.